So when I first read Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe, it struck a chord with me because it was such a clear, readable attack on the racist culture warriors who promote a history of Australia which justifies the dispossession of Aboriginal people and denies the attempted genocide. So, while I disagree with some of Pascoe's political and theoretical arguments, his engaging descriptions of fish traps of many different kinds of designs, the way Aboriginal people manage the land all around the continent, different examples, and how they manage the land and its resources, I think it explains its popularity. And he reminds his readers of the wanton destruction of Aboriginal heritage, the invaders actually recording what they saw while they were destroying it. And like the deliberate vandalism to this day, a recent one being the destruction of fish traps in Western Victoria, when John Howard, the racist Liberal Prime Minister, dishonestly encouraged farmers to think that any evidence of Aboriginal connection with their country would mean they would lose the farmers would lose their farms under native title. Now, a lot of the controversy over Dark Emu is actually easier to interpret than you might think, because it is heavily influenced by the protagonist's politics, and they can be assessed without a lot of knowledge of the theoretical and historical issues. So note, for example, the vitriolic reactionary website Dark Emu Exposed, set up by a collective of quiet Australians who question and want to hold to account authors who appear to be rewriting our Australian history to progress their own particular political narrative, as though that website doesn't. And the new book, Farmers or Hunter-Gatherers, by anthropologist Peter Sutton and archaeologist Karen Walsh, has refueled the debate. And it's easiest understood in the context of Sutton's politics. He wrote all but 2 of the chapters, and Walsh's chapters are so technical, I'm not qualified to venture an opinion. But Sutton is also a linguist, has lived in Aboriginal communities, and has given evidence for native title claims. But he vehemently backed John Howard's profoundly racist Northern Territory intervention in 2007 and stridently attacked those campaigning against it. So when ABC journalist Geraldine Doob asked him why he said opponents of this intervention were appalling, he replied, "People have tried to make this a rallying point for attacking a particular political figure or party or policy," that figure being John Howard. And he argued that those, like himself, who know facts on the ground won't stoop that low. Well, these facts, i.e. the excuse for the military occupation of whole communities, were later proven to be lies. Sutton dismissed those who had supported the radical struggles of the 1970s for Aboriginal rights as having a Eurocentric, culturally blinkered view. And this calculated appeal to enlightened thinking cannot obscure this reactionary conclusion that he offered Doog. He said, basically, freedom and independence and autonomy have now really come asunder. Why? Not because they were denied, Aboriginal people were denied those things. He actually blames them themselves and declares they had their own pathway and they went down it. And this racist conclusion is, I will argue, related to a mechanical, linear method of historical analysis. He just draws a straight line from pre-invasion to today, eliminating the consequences of dispossession and attempted genocide from any analysis of post-invasion society. Now, a less charitable interpretation is that the analysis conveniently justifies his reactionary positions. And the anthropologist Richard Davis makes arguments along those lines. He explains Sutton's reasoning like this. The dreaming, Sutton says, created such a good state of affairs that there was no need for living Aboriginal people to do anything other than what they had been doing from time immemorial. And Davis says this notion of Aboriginal permanence has been seriously questioned by respected anthropologists, and Sutton would be aware of this, so it is surprising that he so strongly adheres to this model of innate dreaming immutability as a substantive reason for why Aboriginal society could not change. And I agree with the two reasons that Davis gives for this argument. He says it conveniently means that Sutton can avoid dealing with material that doesn't support his description, and it supports his conservative view of rural and remote Aboriginal people today. And Davis draws out the connection between the theory of pre-invasion society and Sutton's racism. He says many traditional ways of living are ill-suited to the present day, and a change of politics was needed to bring Aboriginal people into modern ways of living. This is what Sutton argues. It's his summary of it. And Sutton's work arguably provided the intellectual architecture for the 2007 Northern Territory emergency response. And Sutton is so focused on proving that Aboriginal society was not in any process of change, he picks up on what seem like minor disagreements, which are hard to understand if you aren't aware of his basic thesis. So, for instance, he regularly returns to any theorist who describes anything as a sign of the possibility of agriculture. And just as he accuses Pascoe, Sutton, at least sometimes himself, overstates the issue. So, for example, two anthropologists, Tyndale and Lindsay, refer to replanting of tubers as the very beginning of gardening. Elsewhere, Tyndale uses the term proto-agriculture. Now, Tyndale's isn't a particularly surprising statement. Many studies of the transition of early societies from foraging to agriculture trace an awareness about how plants regenerate to ever more conscious practices. But Sutton always assumes that any reference to the possibility as endorsing the idea of an automatic progression. So his response is simply beside the point. He says, but it isn't gardening, it isn't agriculture. And he argues that, quote, it may well have been a long-term stable skill beyond which it was unnecessary to venture and therefore was no proto-anything. Now, that may be so, but we will never know because of the British invasion, which, basically destroyed most Aboriginal culture. And he continues, all these incipient and proto words suggest unfulfilled potential and assume an inevitable progression that is not being completed. Now, who thinks that proto means something inevitable has begun? It's more charitable to interpret it to merely suggest a possibility. So it's one thing to disagree with Pascoe's argument that there was agriculture, which I do, and I'll say something about it later, but another to rule out the possibility that Aboriginal society was in a process of change like most human, well, basically all human societies, as far as I know, and the outcome is never inevitable and predictable. Whereas Dark Emu fits with the most recent research by archaeologists. It debunks the idea that it was only humans foraging for a basic subsistence diet who lived in egalitarian classless societies, because it's now thought that around 20,000 years ago, as the last ice sheets of the Paleolithic era melted, it caused rivers to swell and coastlines to recede. And new ecosystems with abundant animals, fish, fertile soil, good rainfall and the like encouraged nomadic communities to settle more permanently or at least seasonally. Now, predominantly hunting and gathering societies developed various levels of sophisticated technical innovations, increasing human labour productivity. And these developments occurred first, as far as we know, on the northeast coast of Japan and in the Ukraine, later in the northwest coast of the US, in Anatolia, which is eastern Turkey, along a number of rivers in Southeast Asia and in parts of Australia. Now, combining different degrees of sedentism, gathering and hunting, and with simple horticulture, some of these societies even sometimes created a small surplus that they could store for future use. And Pascoe actually disagrees with that explanation, and I'll say something about his position later. Now I want to make a point about those complex gatherer societies, because they remained non-hierarchical societies based on cooperation around the world for millennia, many surviving, like in Australia, until they were invaded by class societies. And this is a powerful argument against those who insist that human nature is a barrier to the creation of socialism and that capitalism is the peak of a preordained process of progressive development. It demonstrates that the development of class divisions was not inevitable, even as technological change increased labour productivity. And you may as well put the next slide up so people can make sure they understand the book I'm talking about. To my mind, Sutton and Walsh's Farmers or Hunter-Gatherers is a nasty book, unleashing unjustified hostility towards Pascoe. Can we have that slide, Janil? In his introduction, Sutton states of Dark Emu that the book's biggest gap is that the evidence is largely confined to material economic behaviour. And Bill Gamage, author of The Greatest Estate on Earth, and Rupert Gerritsen are both disparaged by Sutton as amateurs and who influenced Pascoe. They're included in this criticism. And Sutton asserts that this is often separated from meaning, from intent, from values, from culture, from the spiritual and from the emotional. Now, I think actually it's very difficult to interpret archaeological evidence as to its meaning, what people thought and believed. And anthropologists, there's a whole problems with anthropology. They've interpreted a culture which was being ravished or had already been ravaged by dispossession, and often after people have actually identified as Christians. So, you know, it's not clear that the anthropologists understand those early societies. But in any case, it's strange that Sutton makes this accusation about Pascoe, given he has a chapter, The Heavens, Language and the Law, in which he says, there is no separation between the sacred and non-sacred, as all actions are steeped in religious purpose. And this is very similar, as far as I can understand, to what Sutton argues. In any case, if this is the fundamental problem, why does the book's title centre the debate about whether Aboriginal societies were farmers or gatherer hunters? It plays directly into the culture wars, breathing new life into the righteousness of the racist right, which you will have noticed if you've read much in the more right-wing press about this debate. And the differences that they emphasise, well, Sutton emphasised, are constantly exaggerated. Sutton says, the old people in 1788 had developed ways of managing and benefiting from their landscape that went beyond just hunting and just gathering. They were ecological agents who worked with the environment rather than usually against it. They frequently used slow-burning fires to make their landscape more livable. Now, this is pretty much what Pascoe says in his book, and Sutton's disagreement amounts to this. On the other hand, they did not cut down bush to clear the land, plough and hoe the soil in preparation for planting, or then sow stored seed or tubers or rootstock in gardens or in fields. And like a lot of us disagree with that. People have, you know, people like Gamage. So Sutton and Walsh could easily have written a friendly book identifying with Pascoe's intervention against the culture warriors and still raise their disagreements as others have. So why are they so hostile? Well, if I can keep my voice going. Sutton is clearly an intellectual elitist. He resents the fact that Pascoe an amateur has been widely celebrated. Sutton's absolutely tone deaf to the public debate. He's only interested in those with scientific credentials. Now, unlike Sutton, historian Tom Griffith wrote in 2019 that the eloquent ire that informs Dark Emu has, more than the more scientifically rigorous works, enlivened the engagement of Australians with their country's history. And Gamage also gets it. And actually, he provides a useful insight. He says, in specialist disciplines where jargon and theory are eminent, many academics puzzle over why Dark Emu is so popular. At the recent Canberra launch of Farmers or Hunter-Gatherers, several speakers tackled this puzzle. Not one explanation offered by the speakers was straightforward or aimed at a wider public. All were infused with possibles and alternatives. And we need the next slide, Vanille, so that people can follow this point. He says, this was made clear when a tour operator asked how Aborigines could have cleared the grasslands on Victoria's Tower Hill, as shown in von Gerard's painting, which is the slide. How could they have cleared these grasslands if they walked about all the time? And Gamage says, no answer was straight out that people didn't walk about all the time, that they managed Tower Hill's plants in due season, yet still travelled purposefully to care for their country. The tour operator left early. Not happy, I thought. And Gamage says, who are Pascoe's critics talking to? They're alarmed by what the public is being led to think, by what might be taught in schools, by how much good research is overlooked. Their remedy is to talk to each other. Now, Sutton accuses Pascoe of inviting the use of the discredited primitive versus advanced scale known as social evolutionism. But I would argue that Sutton, like many of the contemporary social scientists, has no adequate critique of a mechanical social evolutionary theory that they're so keen to disown, and in fact remain trapped in it. So I've already illustrated his linear view of history, and Davis comments perceptively, I thought, Pascoe's sin from their point of view is not only that he has embraced a problematic model, but also that he has miscategorized Aboriginal people within it. Aboriginal people, according to Sutton, fall into the best of these problematic categories, his hunter-gatherer plus. Now, I would argue that Sutton's use of this invented category, hunter-gatherer plus, is completely dishonest. He writes, there are isolated and scattered but informative records of the old people expanding the distribution of some wild plants and animals. This is one facet of the plus in hunter-gatherer plus. And again, this is virtually exactly what Pascoe says. And much has been made by Pascoe's critics of his use of the term mere hunter-gatherers. Well, actually, the only instance of this formulation that I can find in the book makes it clear that he's making an ironical side sweep at the racists. He says, arguing over whether the Aboriginal economy was a hunter-gatherer system or one of burgeoning agriculture is not the central issue. The crucial point is that we have never discussed it as a nation. The belief that Aboriginal people were mere hunter-gatherers, mere in inverted commas, has been used as a political tool to justify dispossession. And almost always when people make the accusation against him, they leave out the inverted commas. He says, every land rights application hinges on the idea that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people did nothing more than collect available resources and therefore had no managed interaction with the land. That is, the Indigenous population did not own or use the land. And I'm not the only one, unlike Sutton, who recognises Pascoe's intention. Gamage says, Sutton thinks Pascoe is endorsing mere rather than exploding it. He elaborates on his misunderstanding several times. For example, and he quotes Sutton as saying, it is almost as if the more European the old people can be made to seem, the better. This is Dark Emu's most fundamental flaw. And Gamage's response, I think, is spot on. He says, extraordinary. Here and elsewhere, the more charitable interpretation is that Pascoe is being ironic. And he ought to be able to say that he thinks people were farmers without being called a racist. And we can note as well, now we have a new fundamental flaw that Sutton has identified. And Griffiths also makes some important points. He says agriculture is at the front line of the ideological war about the British colonisation of Australia. As literary historian Tony Hughes-Death has argued, agriculture in Australia is a religion. It is as much a religion as it is an industry. That's why Pascoe has taken it on. I understand, says Griffiths, why Pascoe has deployed the template of agriculture. He is turning a political tool of oppression and disdain into a case for dignity and respect. Archaeologist Rhys Jones did the same in 1969 when he coined the term fire stick farming. It was a brilliant provocation and remains a foundational insight. Now, Sutton says, another thing Gamage and Pascoe share is the preferencing of early explorer and settler accounts over the studies of anthropologists and archaeologists. And Gamage replies, it's odd to require historians to prefer the evidence of people who weren't there over people who were. And I think that both archaeology and anthropology, all their findings are open to question, especially the anthropologists. However, Pascoe, I would say, should not be read uncritically. He blurs the distinction between simply replanting yams or the scattering of seeds, the careful use of fire and fully developed agriculture. And like most polemical writers, he ignores some evidence and emphasises others, but so does Sutton. So, for instance, an exchange between them, Pascoe references Mary Gilmore, the radical poet's account of what Aboriginal people where she grew up in Western New South Wales taught her. And she writes that they planted seed in particular circumstances and they managed fish supplies. But she also added something that Pascoe ignores. And she said the Aboriginals, on the other hand, were a nomad people in a whole continent. Now, Sutton seizes on this as a refutation of Pascoe, but I'd suggest that Gilmore's statement is not conclusive. She couldn't have had sufficient knowledge for such a sweeping statement as across the whole continent. She was recording what she learned in one area. So really her statement doesn't prove either position, Sutton or Pascoe. And given the influence of Gamage on his thinking, I think Pascoe would have done well to employ some of his more subtle descriptions, such as managing the land. Gamage argues that Aboriginal people farmed while they were not farmers. I think this is a subtle distinction, and I heard an interview a few days ago with Sutton on the ABC where he scoffs at this distinction, but I thought it just illustrated his complete lack of imagination that anyone who disapproves of has anything to say. Because it's not inconceivable that people carried on activities that we might think of as some kind of farming, but that they didn't see it in the same way as we do. In any case, in my opinion, this is still somewhat overstates the case, and there's a whole semantic debate about what you can call agriculture, which I'm not going to go into. Sutton snipes that Pascoe doesn't acknowledge that he wasn't the first to write about the 40,000-year-old fish traps at Brewarrina on the Barcoo River. And that's true, but of what significance is it other than point scoring or scholarly pride? And this kind of gratuitous hostility, implying that the problem with Pascoe is he isn't a scholar and so not to be trusted, is littered throughout the book. And we can have our next slide, Vanille. He falsely claims that Pascoe cites evidence which was assembled by Norman Tyndale, quote, as if being revealed for the first time. Well, actually, the map that you can see, Pascoe has put that together based, and he says quite clearly that it's based on Tyndale's research into where Aboriginal communities practiced what they called what Tyndale called proto-agriculture, which if they did, is an incredible difference with what farmers can do today. And I suspect, actually, I'm just trying to point out how nitpicking and gratuitous Sutton is. So to move on, I suspect that the lack of detailed accounts of who first discovered what partly explains the mass appeal of Dark Emu, because you don't have to wade through an exposition on where exactly his arguments fit in the endless debates about social theory, because for many, and I suspect most of his readers, it's their first encounter with these inspiring stories of managing the land by a society that they had been taught did no such thing. And I'm going to say a little something about these famous fish traps in Brewarrina, which we've got a photo on the next slide, Vanille. Because these traps involve complex use of dry stone walls and holding ponds and weirs for managing water and fish stocks. And similar ones and all kinds of different ways of managing the fish supply existed all up and down the Darling and Murray rivers. And they were designed to allow breeding stock through, these particular ones, to continue up the river for others, catching just sufficient for local needs. And different families or clan groups had responsibility for different aspects, all coordinating to ensure there was sufficient for everyone up and down this vast river system, which we can see in the next slide. And Mary Gilmore recorded that she was told that it was a public group duty to see that the traps and weirs were never clogged nor broken down. Now, these all fascinating innovations in ways of managing the resources. And we'll go back to the next slide, Vanille. It's another picture of the traps. However, the most inspiring aspect of these marvels is, I would say, how they encapsulate collective responsibility and shared access to the resources of the rivers. And this escapes everyone, basically, including Sutton, for all his claims of recognising culture and philosophy, except Pascoe. Sutton and Walsh denigrate Pascoe, Bill Gamage and Rupert Gerritsen as amateurs and take pride in their own superior qualifications. But Stephen Mueck, writing in Overland, astutely refers to their scholarship as, quote, a particular mode of truth-telling, one we can rightly call the discourse of the human sciences. And all those who collect this knowledge produce the same kind of text in a special kind of academic English, which have their limits. Yet the discourse is a powerful one. It can perform a magical trick. The person writing it can supposedly see objectively and omnisciently. They can see the whole country from above. The first image in Farmers or Hunter-Gatherers is a map of Australia. And from this initial viewpoint, one can zoom in on the details and describe them. And I share Mueck's cynicism about this discourse. He goes on to say the practitioners of this discourse can pop up as expert witnesses in native title hearings across the country. As authorities, they can cite earlier experts and their own first-hand experience with Aboriginal knowledge holders, or co-researchers, as they're called today. They used to be called informants. And in fact, Sutton's scholarship, as I've already begun to indicate, does not indicate that his arguments have any more rigour than Pascoe's. To prove that Aboriginal societies were not on an inevitable path to farming, he appeals to a generality, says the shift is not in every case a one-way journey. Well, this may be a true statement, but as an argument about whether Aboriginal society was transitioning to agriculture or not, it's irrelevant. It lacks all logic and rigour. Only concrete investigation can resolve the question about any particular society. And he cites as evidence the reversion to hunting and gathering by the people living on the South Island of New Zealand when the Maori occupied it. And again, as with his history of Australia, he just ignores the impact of an invasion and occupation as a possible explanation for why people reverted to earlier methods of subsistence. So just a couple of points before concluding. I don't have the time to explain the Marxist attitude to social evolution theory. It's a whole discourse of its own. However, Marxists turn on its head the idea that gatherer hunters are at the bottom of any hierarchy of societies and capitalism at the top. We celebrate those pre-class egalitarian societies based on cooperation and reciprocity, and we despise the inhuman class societies which now dominate the globe. As Marx and Engels realised, humans are innovative and creative, and as they act on the world, they change it and they change themselves, how they organise and how they see themselves and the world around them. And to posit that Aboriginal society is fundamentally different from this, as Sutton does with his label of immutability, is to divide them off from the whole of human history. Socialists actually prefer to embrace what we can discover of their societies as part of the wonder of humanity. Pascoe disagrees with all of this. He says Aboriginal people were not reacting to the state of nature, but directly affecting it. And he has a very confused passage about it all, which, it's not worth trying to unravel it all, but Marxists wouldn't pose this either or dichotomy. Instead, we argue there is a dialectical interaction between the objective conditions humans find themselves in, human creativity and social organisation, and subjective consciousness. So to conclude, Sutton and his supporters are calling for Dark Emu to be removed from the school curriculum, and this is outrageous. And it's made even more so if instead Sutton's politics are fed to students. In 2001, he argued in an anthropology forum, the ancient social order, while resting on a mixture of internal and external constraints like any other, depended very highly on external mechanisms of control, including fear of physical or supernatural harm or death. In this sense, the authoritarian and patriarchal regimes of most of the early Christian missions were structurally and philosophically, culturally appropriate in a way that recent liberalised and more chaotic regimes have not been. Well, I don't want this whitewashing of the racist genocidal policies carried out by the churches being fed to our children through their curriculum. Dark Emu broke the hold of the racist right on what can be said about pre-invasion. Pre-invasion Aboriginal people. Pascoe read historical records against the grain. He challenged the lingering assumption that Aboriginal people were primitive hunter-gatherers who did nothing with the land, because nobody thinks that that's the case anymore except the racist right. And as Davis says, White Australia's embrace of the book marks a significant cultural turn in Australia, suggesting that there is widespread hunger to learn about Indigenous people's remarkable ways of life. Pascoe and the underlying work of Gerritsen show that a thoughtful person can stimulate new understanding and further exploration. And we can see an example of that in the next slide, Vanille. Because there's a new exciting archaeological dig which has been inspired by Pascoe in the Channel Country in Central Australia. It's being overseen by traditional Mithaka elders with the assistance of scientists, and employing sophisticated technology, studying the records of the first European invaders and records of anthropologists. They have found what they think is evidence of aquaculture, evidence of trading, and a large population. In contrast, Sutton and Walsh present a rigid view of Aboriginal society as unchanging, and they've rebooted the confidence of racist culture warriors. They fail to engage in a meaningful way with Pascoe's arguments, trapped as they are in that discourse of the social sciences and of Sutton's, at least, support for reactionary racist policy. So I have our last slide just as a nice little symbol as I make my final point. Because in a final rebut to the uncharitable charge that Pascoe encourages not admiration for Aboriginal societies as they were, but for the fact that they were becoming more like ours, I give him the last word. He wrote in the book, if the test of sophistication were whether or not all were fed regardless of rank, or whether all contributed to the spiritual and cultural health of the civilization, Aboriginal Australia might have a much higher rank than some of the nations considered the hallmark of human evolution. And I'll pass it over to you now for all your debates and controversies. You can disagree with me if you want.